Recognized member for Fredericton West Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's always a pleasure to follow my honourable colleague opposite. I find him to be a man who's very straightforward, and I enjoy working with him on a number of committees. And I think he might have drawn the short straw on this one, though. It is a bit of a dry matter, but we appreciate its housekeeping, and I think he's done an excellent job of outlining the pieces of legislation that are concerned with this motion today. I will similarly go through a few of them, but it did bring a smile to my face when he started, because I felt almost like he picked up the wrong speech. Because he went right into the classic messaging that's coming out of the government about deficit, about choices, about strategic program review, about finances. And Mr. Speaker, I know that's the messaging this government wants to put forward, and I know that it's always front-end loaded in all their speeches. But of course, Mr. Speaker, what it permits me the opportunity to do is, once he's introduced those things into debate, I get to comment on them. So, Mr. Speaker, I have some concerns about some of these matters that the member raised at the beginning of his speech. As I've said in this House before, I'm concerned that what we're being presented with by this government is, in fact, a set of false choices. They've been very clever in putting forward some choices to the people of New Brunswick, saying we need to reduce our deficit, and if we want to do that, we have to do all these things, which are harsh cuts, or, by the way, we could just raise taxes and make it all go away. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that's a fair choice. I don't believe it's an accurate choice. I think it's very misleading. It bothers me. It cuts to the core of what's going on here. And I think that what this government needs to do is be really transparent. If they want to offer the people of New Brunswick choices, they need to put all of those choices on the table. They have to be honest about what's happened with their slush fund, $150 million a year that we have, into which we have no transparency, Mr. Speaker. That's a pretty big number, and that would be, for example, about half of an HST increase, 1 percentage point on an HST increase. And as well, Mr. Speaker, as you know, there's over $150 million a year going into paving around this province that, in my opinion, is not necessarily warranted. And I know the Premier loves to draw the false dichotomy between, and say to us, well, if you don't support paving, tell us which projects you don't support. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot there that I believe is unnecessary. And we need the government to be transparent with us so we can do the due diligence and get into that and figure out what is necessary and what's not. And Mr. Speaker, another example of sort of this false choice that we're seeing a lot from the government is the issue about ATCON. And I know that the government must have felt that really reared its ugly head again today. And that monster, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, is going to come back to bite this government. We know that the Premier has made a decision to put the same ministers into this cabinet, the same ministers that were around the table when the ATCON decision was made. In fact, some of the key ministers involved in that decision are currently some of the key ministers of this government. And, Mr. Speaker, that's a fundamental flaw, and I'm afraid that this Premier is going to find out the hard way that he's entrusted the decision-making of this province to some faulty processes and members that have proven in the past that they're able to stray from the rules. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that's going to unfold in the next few days. But I do find it, once again, sort of indicative of this false dichotomy that this government wants to paint, that the Premier can stand here in the House and say, yes, as the Premier, I support the work of the Auditor General. I think the Auditor General should examine questions with regard to ATCON. And he said that today, again, in question period. And then in this very same breath, Mr. Speaker, he says he's not willing to provide those resources. He's not willing to step forward and commit the resources that the Auditor General has asked for. And it's not like it's a mystery, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General has clearly said what the cost of a forensic audit would be. It has asked the government for that money. And so it's a bit disingenuous when the Premier stands up and says, yeah, I support that initiative, and yet he, as the Premier, is not willing to finance it or resource it. The Auditor General has been clear. She's told this House what she needs to do that job. She's told this House that she's going to do it. And the Premier, if he wants her to do it, if he does, in fact, support her doing it, as he's told us, he needs to resource her properly. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, although this bill is a housekeeping matter, this opposition is going to keep pushing that button because there's more to be found out with regard to ATCON, and we believe the Auditor General is the person to do it, and we believe that in order to do that, she needs to be properly resourced. But I do want to come back to the matter directly at hand. And, Mr. Speaker, I have reviewed some of the bits of legislation that are considered under this bill. As you know, we have on this side of the House, we have a tremendous respect for our civil servants. We're privileged in this province to have a very professional, highly skilled, highly educated civil service. And it's their job to provide the government with advice. And this today is an example of advice that's come forward from these various departments that are affected by these statutes that are set to to be dissolved. And these departments have come forward and explained the reasons, which the member Cook-Trantermar has pointed out are pretty straightforward, why these bits of legislation need to stay on the books, at least for another year. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the Statute Repeal Act, what it basically says is when legislation is getting old and stale every year, if it's not being acted on, it should be done away with. That's effectively what it's saying. And the reason for that, Mr. Speaker, is that bits of legislation do accrue over time, and if they're kept hanging around, they may end up having they may end up having an effect that wasn't in accordance with their original intent. And it's incumbent on government to renew this process and make sure that it's doing everything it can to eliminate legislation that's not required and to bring forward fresh legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I've often heard it said in legislatures there should perhaps be a law that every time the government introduces a bill, it needs to repeal another one. Well, I'm not necessarily of that mind, but the intent behind the Statute Repeal Act is something similar, that there shouldn't be legislation or statutes just kicking around out there that haven't come into force. And, Mr. Speaker, in fact, some of these pieces of legislation, these statutes, have been kicking around for over 40 years. Now, as I said, the member opposite has done a very good job of outlining them. I'm just going to touch on a few points with each of these right now. The Metric Conversion Act, as we see it applies to a number of pieces of legislation that are on the books right now. It's worth noting that this particular thing has been around for 40 years, so certainly lots of governments have come and gone in over 40 years, and we're all equally responsible for the fact that these individual pieces of legislation haven't been updated. But I would suggest to the government opposite that this is a good opportunity to flag up the issue of the Liquor Control Act. Because, Mr. Speaker, the piece about Metric is not the only thing in the Liquor Control Act that needs updating. In fact, that's a very antiquated piece of legislation. And I will admit freely that subsequent governments have come and gone without doing necessary changes. And I see that the Minister of Public Safety is very interested in this file, and I'd like to work with him on that piece of legislation. I previously, as a member for Fredericton-Silverwood, I had responsibility for much of the downtown area, but certainly I have a lot of friends in the restaurant industry, and they're deeply affected by this act. So the time has come, I think, to make some changes to that, and I'm keen to work with the Minister of Public Safety on that, and I'd like to involve my constituents in that process. So I hope that this is a trigger, perhaps, to remind us that this piece of legislation has been kicking around for 40 years. It's time to do something about it and update it. So that's the Metric Conversion Act. With regard to the Pension Benefits Act, Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite has clearly outlined, this refers really to the introduction by the previous government of the Shared Risk Pension Plan. And I understand that this particular statute needs to be kept on the books to enable some of those discussions. It's worth underlining, though, Mr. Speaker, that one of the key promises of this government during the last election was that they would revisit the Shared Risk Pension Plan. And as far as I can tell, Mr. Speaker, not much progress has been made on that file. I understand there's still some ongoing litigation, which is fine, but this government, in the process of seeking to be elected, and they were successful in that, they did promise to the people of New Brunswick and the people affected by this plan that they were going to revisit it. Now, I've stood in this House before and said that I support the Shared Risk Pension Plan. I've said that to my constituents. I do support it, but if this government promised to revisit it, they should be doing that. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit disappointed they haven't been more active on that file, and we'll certainly be encouraging them to take advantage of their position now in government to make some real change there, as they promised many of my constituents. As far as the agricultural piece goes, Mr. Speaker, of course, we value very much the role agriculture has in this province. I think there's a lot of potential there. It's something that New Brunswick can harness further. I applaud the government's steps forward on blueberries that in fact, I think were initiated under the previous government. I think maple syrup is something that they have as well continued to support, and I strongly support that. There's lots more that can be done with our agricultural sector, and I see that there's some ongoing public consultation, and that's really the reason that this is included as a statute that needs to stay on the books. I encourage the government to proceed quickly with that consultation and maybe wrestle this to the ground, because we do need to do everything, Mr. Speaker, to encourage our agricultural sector in this province. And then the final piece is about the judiciary. I'm proud to say I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Speaker. I don't understand all the bits and pieces that go along with this piece of legislation, but I do understand that perhaps it's in the hands of the federal government to create these positions. And so now that the new government shares the same color as our federal government, it gives them a great opportunity to raise this issue again. And as the member opposite has outlined, I think there is an opportunity here to improve the efficiency of our court system. And if they could appeal to the federal government to create the positions that are outlined in this piece of legislation that's that has been kicking around for a while, let's see if we can nail that down. So, Mr. Speaker, there's some good stuff in there. There's some stuff that the government's got some work to do. It's got to really have a good look at the Liquor Control Act. I think they need to make good on their promise to review the shared risk pension plan, and if it's a problem, change it, and if it's good, at least be honest with New Brunswickers about their intention to maintain it and extend it to other groups. And Mr. Speaker, I do once again reiterate my concerns that this government is presenting the people of New Brunswick very often with a false dichotomy, and that is they're saying one thing and doing another, and we saw an example of that today when the Premier spoke about ATCON. So, Mr. Speaker, we do need to make sure that the officers of our government are empowered and that they are resourced properly to do the job they need to do, and that cuts to the chase with the Attorney General and the Auditor General. They need to be given the resources that they need to do the tasks that they've identified. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying yea.
Yay!
Those opposed, nay. My opinion, the yeas have it, and I declare the motion carried.